I've talked in the past about politics in comics because this is one of those kind of third rail conversations that I feel like people gravitate to, and they don't. And nobody wants to kind of admit the facts around them. So let me, and I've done talked about this before. This is like at least twice before, but I mean, hell, YouTube's telling me I've put up over like 1,000 videos at this point. So I mean, who's watching them all? Nobody's saying that's who. Anyway, let's talk politics in comics. Hey everybody, this is Perch. This is one of those topics that I think is actually a lot simpler than people make it out to be. But like with all things politics, you can't have it be simple anymore. Politics are a lightning rod for people, and they tend to go to extreme absolutes. Either whatever side you happen to be on, we tend to gravitate toward absolutes with our politics. And I think, one indicator of this, and try this out for yourself. If you are on social media, Twitter or Facebook, and you find somebody who's just coming in to argue with you for no apparent reason, just that, like you say something, it would be most easy for people to look at your tweet and go, this guy's an idiot. But instead, the person decides to come in and just like go immediately for an attack, usually a sarcastic attack, like one that feels like they're writing dialogue for a sitcom where the crowd, like the canned audience, could be like, "Ooh," but it's really not a good burn because it doesn't make any sense. Anyway, follow to that person's page, and almost 100% of the time, you will find, depending on your side of the argument, I've experienced both, just nothing but retweets of their political party of choice, and just over and over and over. It's like it's the most boring account ever. I mean, these have got to be the bots, right? Because I mean, what human beings are living like this? I mean, imagine being on social media and like all you do there is retweet propaganda from your party. Like that's all you do. Like imagine like months go by and you've got up, I don't know, you've got up 20 tweets a day from your party, often more. Like, how crazy is that? It just like that's not an interesting person. I don't really care whether you're, yay Trump or boo Trump. It's like you're a very boring person at that point. I'm sorry, you just are. No matter how wound up you feel about that, like your wall sucks, bro. Anyway, politics have been in comics for like ever. Yes, it's true. They have. People often go, that, oh, we need comics back in the old days when they didn't do politics. Well, that's a misleading statement. Comics have done politics forever. They have. You can go back to whatever era you want to talk about: Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age. You will see political and social themes crop up in comics all over the place. Absolutely. And by and large, if you're keeping score, usually more left leaning by the time we get into the 60s. And there's a really easy reason for this. A lot of creatives are left leaning, and they wrote what they knew. And so they would put this content in. And plus, the idea of a lot of left wing politics tends to fit kind of the ideology. Now, hang with me here. Some people immediately like hovering over the disagree, but if you think about kind of left wing ideology to kind of a very optimistic conclusion, it does tend to align with superheroes, with this idea that a person with powers can come in and just save everyone, and that these things are possible. That again, nothing is absolute, but it does tend to align more with that. And I also recognize that in 2020, the idea of what is left wing and what is right wing is kind of all over the place anymore. But if you kind of picture like the politics of the 80s, you remember, because I collected comics in the 80s. The politics of the 80s, a lot of that stuff fit. There is a difference, though, and this is where I think one side will say politics have always been in comics, and they're right. But the politics have not always been represented this way in the comics. And what I mean by this way is kind of twofold. First, comics used to, knock on wood, not 100% by any stretch of imagination, and by the way, anyone can and has gone off and found a panel somewhere that refutes their point. However, in general, comics tended to treat politics slightly more evergreen. And what do I mean by evergreen? I mean that the themes were designed to survive more than like a month. There was an attempt of saying, hey, we're writing this comic in such a way that 10 years from now, the themes and the message and that stuff will still be valid. You didn't see as many, and granted, there still were some, parodies of, say, Ronald Reagan. He would show up every now and then, but not nearly as much as Trump shows up in comics. And the reason for that has actually very little to do with comics and a lot to do with just how people now respond to political figures. Trump is ripe for parody everywhere. I mean, you have people spending money on making a giant kind of Trump dressed as a baby balloon that they can fly around in the sky. Here in Seattle, people were making pictures of Trump with or not pictures, statues of Trump with like a really tiny penis. And then they were putting it on street corners. I don't know why people were doing that. I think they thought we're making fun of Trump. But to me, I look at that and I'm like, you're spending a lot of money making a statue of a guy you dislike with a tiny penis. That seems like a big waste of time and money. But I mean, maybe you made some people laugh, I guess. Did you profit off? I mean, I always play these things out. Like, was there a Republican walking down the street who's like, I like Trump, and then he sees your statue and it's like, you know what? Seeing this statue of him with a tiny penis, I now will rethink my political ideology. I'm going to change parties, and I will not vote for Trump. Is that what? That didn't happen. So I don't get the point. Anyway, regardless, comics are a little less subtle. And when I say subtle, because subtle can mean a lot of different things. And again, some people can immediately whip out panels in the 80s. There was certainly plenty of comics that did political satire and did these jokes. But on a whole, these themes and these topics were handled a little bit less with the buzzwords of today. And I like to use this analogy. Rather than talk about politics, rather than go completely into if comics are more or less political than they used to be, use this as an example. Comics draw from pop culture, current pop culture. Be it a joke on the Big Bang Theory that the writer thought was really funny, might show up in a lot of comics. Look at some of Bendis's writing. It's very contemporary to this exact time period. Look at how many people in comics watch Game of Thrones and would be saying things like, you bent the knee, you guard the wall, as analogies, and they would just get infused into comics. I mean, even Kieran Gillen, who is a good writer. I mean, when he did his comic Siege or Secret Wars, not the original Siege, but the Secret Wars, the Hickman event Siege, and it was about the wall that was separating kind of the Happy Doom world and the zombies and everything else on the other side of the wall. And so the bad people had to go to the wall. And it was very much an analogy on Game of Thrones, and they used a lot of Game of Thrones language. And if you watch Game of Thrones, you'd read this comic and you would feel like this is ripping off Game of Thrones. Well, historically, most comics, particularly ones by the big two, but because the indies would do direct parodies and other things all the time, but typically big two comics did less of that. They wouldn't go so all in on revealing their source or basically transparently putting these topics out on the page. So why do I bring this up as it relates to politics? Well, it's the same thing. A lot of political themes are put out on the page of just like current talking points of something Jimmy Kimmel might have said last night. It's going direct from kind of, Trevor Noah to the comic page. And that's, you're just reading kind of these, political commentators. There was a bit in, it was in the X-Men relaunch before the Hickman took over. And I don't remember whether it was Bresson or Kelly Thompson or Rosenberg. I think there was another writer in there too. But there's basically John Oliver did kind of a comedy bit on the show. And then in the comic, they use that exact same comedy bit. 4 months later, it shows up in the comic. And clearly, it went from somebody watched that, thought it was clever, put it into the comic. And it was very transparent. It wasn't hidden very well. And it was there. Now, many people label this as, propaganda or I'm not getting into that whole topic of kind of woke talking points showing up in the comics, but that's why I want to point out in a different way because I think it helps illustrate the whole concept. Forget for the moment whether it's politics or woke or anti woke or SJW or anti or whatever. Forget all that for a moment and just look at it as laziness, because at the end of the day that's kind of what it is. It's taking a topic that somebody else did, it's throwing it into the comic. It doesn't really fit there. That's why I say, again, comics in the 70s had a ton of political and social themes. The difference was that you got the feeling that the writer actually took some care to handle it well, that there's actually thought into how this story would progress and how this theme would go down, and showing different views of it, and in many ways landing the point very, very well. A lot of stuff that went on in Green Arrow, Spider-Man back in the day, some stuff that Roy Thomas did, others. I mean, there were some stories in there that were very political. And a lot of people point to, oh, look at Alan Moore and Watchmen or V for Vendetta. Yeah, those two, sure, but those are a little too obvious. Look at some of the messaging around drug abuse, around kind of racism, social rights. I mean, there were stuff in comics, absolutely, in the 70s, in the 80s that touched upon these things. She-Hulk's run by John Byrne touched on some of these social issues, absolutely. And it's in the first 4 or 5 issues. It was in there. The difference was it felt more reasonably done. And now, at one point, I got challenged on this assumption and said, well, you were younger, so you just remember it better than you do today. Now you're older, now you've seen a lot of it, so you're less tolerant of it today because you've seen so much of it before. And if you went back and read those issues today, you'd actually discover they weren't nearly as subtle as you think. So I took that challenge and I went back and I did read those issues, and I disagree. In many cases, they were handled with a lot more delicacy. They were handled with more care, and it's that word again, evergreen. They were handled in such a way that if I read the comic 5, 10, 20 years later, a lot of the themes would still hold up. Maybe I agreed with where they were going, maybe I didn't, but it felt like there was some care in there. And that's, I think, the change that's happened in more recent times, is these themes and these approaches just kind of get shot out, with a lot less care and a lot less thought. And it's almost all part of kind of this disposable feeling that a lot of comics have today, where it just feels like they're racing to meet a deadline, get things out. And so that's why I brought up the whole Game of Thrones analogy and other things. It feels like a lot of these topics are just disposable, for lack of a better word. And I think the politics stuff fits into that. So that's how I view it. Are there more politics in comics today? I don't think so, but maybe there's probably bigger overall mass, maybe, because so much of our pop culture is political. But the bigger topic is those topics are handled with a lot less care. That's what I think. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on this whole matter. Am I on something? Am I not? Give me a big downvote if you think I'm crazy. Let me know in the comments below. Like, subscribe, click the bell for notifications. Most importantly, thanks for listening.